right, so welcome to week 13. We're doing actually March book 2, and this is a little bit thicker than book 1, and you knew how much I had to say about book 1. We're not going to cover everything with book 2. There's just no way we can cover everything with here. And then even next week with Nate and Andrew zooming in with us, we're not going to be able to cover everything in book 3 or the whole trilogy. So kind of what I want to do is just kind of give you broad overviews and actually kind of talk with Tim Smyth, who was our guest this week, and he's in Philadelphia. He is a middle school or high school social studies teacher. Doesn't really matter.
High school
social studies teacher, and has been using comics, as you can see in the background. Is this your classroom where you're at?
Oh no, this is my home, although
Okay.
My classroom kind of looks the same.
But using comics in the classroom for a while, and I noticed down there the Nate Powell shelf with Any Empire, and I don't remember the name of the collection, but the collection of short stories, which is really good.
Yeah, save it for later is really good too.
That's a really good book for you to read. I'm not sure if you'll be able to teach it in middle school or high school, but definitely one worth reading. Anything by Nate Powell I think is worth reading. But he has a really great website, just historycomics.net, and I actually put a link to it on Canvas. And he has a book that just came out, Teaching with Comics and Graphic Novels, Fun and Engaging Strategies to improve close reading and critical thinking in every classroom. And I haven't dug around too much on his site, but he has so much here and worth following on Twitter. But you can look over here, the different kind of sections on his website, and all of these pages have information about comics in the classroom, different texts to possibly use, and you see how lengthy the list is, and it is of course in alphabetical order, which is always good. So thank you for just taking the time after teaching school to kind of be with us here today, Tim.
Yeah, my pleasure.
So let's just get going. How long have you been using March in your classroom, I guess? And how do you use it in your classroom? Let's just start with that.
So I've been using it since it first came out. I met John Lewis and Andrew and Nate at San Diego Comic-Con when they came out to present, and I was out there presenting myself. March book 1, I have my kids, since it's dinner, we really get into how to read comics and what they look like, and how to analyze the visual literacy and that piece of it. And I give them like a giant packet in terms of answering some questions and going out and doing other research. And then today, it's kind of funny, we actually just started book 2. And so then once we have all the nitty gritty, humanities type things, book 2, I basically just give them a pile of sticky notes and we just read the book. And whenever they are so moved, they write in question marks, exclamation points, things that stuck out to them. And it winds up being just a great conversation in the classroom. And in this case, I teach 11th graders. It's the lowest level course that we have in our school. And a lot of these kids will tell me that these are the first books that they've ever read completely through. And it's the first time that they've had the opportunity to literally just sit and discuss. So I literally will sit at my desk, put my feet up, we use the sticky notes, and we just have conversations as they come. And it's a really great experience. And then in book 3, I do a combination of the two. Since there is so much in book 3. Book 2 is my favorite, by the way, but in book 3, I just give them like a collection of pages. So I go through it where it makes sense, about 20 pages or so, and they just write a brief summary, and then we also get to discuss. So we treat each book as a different strategies, in other words.
And do they talk about, when they're looking at it, specifically book 3, breaking down kind of the panels or breaking down the sequential art within it as well, and how Powell moves from image to image and kind of the way that carries the story just as much as the text does?
Yeah, and so we actually start with the Montgomery story, that free comic that came out in the 60s.
Right, and they read that last week for book 1.
Oh, great. So we start with that. So we do all the basics, because a lot of times I think we forget that a lot of these kids have never read a comic book before in their lives. And so they get to me in 11th grade, and even my most gifted readers, they get frustrated because they're not paying attention to the images and they're losing a lot of the story. But by the time we get to book 2 and 3, they're kind of experts at it. So I don't need to do that as much. And they're always like, yelling at each, across the room and pointing things out and looking at the images, and then they disagree over what the images mean. And that's exactly what I want them to do. I want them to come up with their own interpretation.
Yeah, and I know me as a comic book reader, I'm not relatively new anymore. I mean, a few years into this, and I started getting a pull list and everything too. But I'm thinking about, I was just reading issue number 9 of The Good Asian, and I'm like, I read through these things so quick that I miss things. I think what people don't realize, and especially students, but even educators, what they don't realize is that when you're teaching a graphic novel or a comic, I think it's a lot more time consuming than just teaching a prose text or a poem or something like that, or a play, because you're having to do so much more kind of critical thinking, examining the juxtaposition of word and image, of what something means without the text there. It's saying something, right? It's working on so many different kind of forms of literacy that you're doing a lot. And when I typically read a graphic novel, I read it through the first time really quick, and I'll look at just basically the text, because I'm in English and literature and I'm a textual learner. I mean, I'm textual, right? And then it's not till the second or third time through that I really start paying attention more to kind of the sequence of images, unless they jump out to me at first, or just specific panels, right? And I think that's kind of what we need to think about too, is that this is a lot more time consuming, and I would say a lot more, it's a lot more engaging. I don't know the right word to use, a lot more taxing, may not even be the right word, but it takes a lot more to read these types of text.
Yeah, I agreed 100%. And like I said, I've read all these books multiple times, and every year I read it with the kids, because I bring different things to that book, and I interpret things differently, and I see things that I haven't caught before. So even though I've read these books many, many times, I'm still seeing new things.
But that's with any text though too, right?
Sure.
And I mean, I think that comes with our, and that's another thing we need to think about too, is when we read text at different stages in our life. I mean, students can read the Scarlet Letter when they're in high school, but then when they read it, say after college, or when they're like 30s or 40s, totally different kind of thing. Same thing with March. Yeah. And then the historical context too, because you can't read these 3 books, I would say, without the context of what's happened over the past few years, without the context of book bannings, because I think Andrew was very specific, and I'll ask him this next week, about the fact that they knew that him and Nate and Representative Lewis probably too, that this book may be banned or challenged, right? They were very upfront about it, and these books came out in 2013 under Obama.
Yep. I've actually been, kind of knocking on wood. I haven't gotten any pushback, and we've been involved with books being challenged in our district, just like we're seeing across the country. But I think, and I'm always afraid, like, oh, here's this Democrat in this book, and it's not. It's not about Democrats or Republicans. It's
right.
Literally, yeah, it's about the history here. And I've had some parents who were kind of questioning in terms of just using a comic book, and I always invite them to come in and actually read the book. And every time they bring it back, going, oh, wow, like their mind's absolutely blown that they didn't know that comic books were like this.
Well, I forgot about this, and we don't need to go down this rabbit hole, I know, but wasn't there, Andrew, I think, posted something on Twitter about somebody who was involved in January 6th, right? And you may remember this if you saw it, but then the judge during the sentencing had them read March, right? And they talked about how March impacted them.
I didn't know that. Wow.
Yeah, I think it was a female participant in January 6th. I don't remember exactly who it was. I have to look it back up. But even kind of that, now what impact it has, who knows? But just kind of that thing, that kind of knowledge of having somebody, I wouldn't just say March, but any text, the impact of text and knowledge, and reading voices that aren't your own, for one, right? So, all right, so let's get into the book a little bit. And since you talk about the way that you have students kind of do this, I have it pulled up right here. What are some of your students' favorite pages and panels, and what do they kind of say about them? So let's kind of talk about that.
So, actually, it's funny, we were talking about the Children's March earlier, but you've got a full splash page.
What page number? I got it pulled up right here.
Oh, cool. Yeah, I'm trying to find the page myself. This is actually one of the kids' books. Just going through, I mean, all the different sticky notes and everything else, and sometimes I get like a WTF exclamation point
exactly
in the book. but you know, we'll take a look like on page 120 when they're at the pool, just like as an example. And then we go out and we take a look at like the images that Nate kind of basic. There you go. So
Here's
this is this is an actual picture. And so we go ahead and we go out and we take a look. And that's usually one of the questions when we notice how this is a completely different artistic style.
And this is, have your students read Darkroom by Weaver?
I've read it. I have not had my students read it.
Yeah, and of course, this is how hers is, that very photorealistic style. And that comes partly from her father and also from her artistic style.
Yep. Go
ahead.
Yeah, no, I mean, you know, there's be like a sticky note with a wow and different things like that. There's one image, and I'm trying to remember which book it is, that comes out all the time when the Freedom Riders pull into the station.
I want to talk about that.
And you see the little kid. I'm trying to find this.
So let's go to that, because it's actually one of the ones that I always focus on. It's about page 80, because that 2-page the Aretha is right there. And then let's go back. So this is where the Freedom Riders come into, this is Montgomery, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So this panel, or this page, when I first read this, really stuck out to me.
Yeah.
Specifically this part up here at the top, where you have the kid with James Waird, right? And he's attacking him. Others are attacking him too. So you have this kind of 4-panel sequence right here. And you see him kicking him, you see the boy right here. And then you see, it sounds like the boy's father, you know, telling his son harder. And it looks like probably his mother there kind of egging him on, right? And then you see the kind of the close-up of the boy's eye, the boy's hand going for Zweigg's eyes. And then the father saying, "That's my boy, get him them eyes, get them eyes." Then this panel is what caught me. Because what you see here, and I think even connected with the previous one, you're being put in the position of James Waird, kind of from the point of view, right? And the boy's looking for your eyes. And I think I've shared these pictures with my students before, but what this makes me think about, and actually I'm gonna pull it back up real quick. It makes me think back to some other images that I've seen before, and I may have shared these with them before, I'm not sure. And I put this actually on Canvas as well. So this is a piece that I did for AAIHS on racism and racial violence in the comics, and actually on these panels. And in this piece, I talk about these 2 images right here. These are 2 paintings. Reginald Marsh is on the right, and then I forgot the other guy's name, so I don't talk about his much. Cadmus, but I don't remember his first name, I apologize. On the left. These are both images that these artists produced. Reginald Marsh is white. I don't remember if Cadmus is or not. But these are both images produced for the NAACP for the 1935 An Art Commentary on Lynching, which was an artistic exhibit in New York focused around lynching and about acknowledging lynching, bringing, you know, education to it. It had sculptures, paintings, other things like that too. But I always point to these kind of images. One, the Cadmus, because of the way that it's framed, and the guy with his hands, kind of like Danny, looking down and clawing at the black victim, right? And I always go to this one right here on the left from Reginald Marsh, because it shows the influence and the indoctrination of everything. Because you don't see the victim in this image. What you see is the crowd. And then you see the little girl looking onto the victim who was off panel, right? But then what also kind of is important too is you come back to that splash page, or that 2-page here, where you move the past. Oh, I'm not sharing, I'm sorry. Where you move, as we do throughout here, the past into the present, right? With Aretha Franklin singing at the inauguration, and the song that she's singing, right? My Country 'Tis of Thee. And then you have these little inserts of what happened in 1961, right? The policeman just smoking, doing nothing. Somebody beaten with the car door open, right? Danny looking at his hands saying, "What have I done?" Lewis and Zwerg right here, right in the famous photo, basically the hands, and then the guys congratulating themselves, with the Confederate battle flag. So the ways that the past kind of influences the present. And one thing that I shared with you, I may pull this up in a second. It actually does deal a little bit with politics, so just keep that in mind. But it's a piece that I wrote looking at the reaction to the March on Washington and also to civil rights photography, and I talk about this here, right? Think about this: the kid who's doing that. This is 1961. The kid who's doing that is now a grandparent now, or at least a parent if they had kids, right? His parents may still be alive, so this is not the long distance past. This is still here, right? And I think that that's something that we need to keep in mind. Okay, sorry.
No, we make exactly the same connection with the boy, and I'm like, that you're talking about my mom. So here I am, the kind of the same, that next generation, and it's the same thing when we teach through a textbook. Like, World War II is over. We had the trial for the Nazis, and next chapter. Well, the Nazis didn't just disappear. And so it's that same message, right? That these people are still in our country. We've had Nazis in our own country, and Madison Square Garden, and all those kinds.
And I think I shared with you all that video one night at the Garden, if I remember correctly. And that's I did when we taught Mouse. That's something that we need to remember, right? And this is the piece that I'm going to share with you. But the one thing I talk about is the way we think about, right, the use of photographs. And notice March is just in black and white. Nate Powell's work typically is just black and white and shades, right? Shades of black and white. This is Ruby Bridges, who integrated New Orleans public schools in, I always forget, 60 or 61. I think maybe 61. This is the image we think about, right? If we're looking at her, and this is in black and white. She's younger than my parents. This is what it's like colorized. How does kind of the colorization of it change? And yes, the shades are still older, we can tell, but how does that change it? These are actually articles from my local newspaper about the March on Washington, which I may pull up in a second, but I think that's important to think about. And what does even having this in black and white instead of color do?
I think it's for my kids. Like we watch some Twilight Zone episodes from the 1960s, talk about the Cold War, and it actually, for them, seeing it in black and white, it shocks them in a sense. It's that different than what they're used to, and it kind of really, I think, makes them focus on what's going on in a way that they're not used to. It's kind of neat to watch that at first when they first see it.
But they still seem like it's so far removed, though, right?
Yeah.
I think that's the flip side of it. I mean, they're not used to seeing black and white, but they're thinking it's like in the past that it's not here anymore. I remember as a kid used to think that people saw in black and white before the invention of color TV. And my son actually said that too, which is kind of a shock to me. So what are some other panels that kind of stick out for them, or some other pages?
What my students will, after we read through all three, a lot of them will comment on the use of, you said, the Confederate battle flag, the stars and bars, on the helmets of the sheriff, on some of the police officers. And it's not in your face, but it's kind of always there.
And see, I haven't noticed those. Do you have a page with that? Well, I haven't noticed them on the officers.
Well, I was looking on page 69, where it's kind of in the shadows. But when they first come across the Evan Pettis Bridge in book 1.
Well, right here but it's not on the officers' uniforms, right?
So I'm trying to find, I know right in the very beginning, because it's in multiple pages. I wish I had thought to kind of.
But this panel, I mean, this panel is eerie too. I mean, the way that the Klan is outside with kind of, they're not red, but kind of like red looking eyes, right? And they're looking out. I mean, that's just an eerie panel.
And then the eyes in the bottom panel, and then the panel at the top. I mean, it evokes so much emotion. And that's what I say all the time, that the students, by seeing the story through John Lewis's eyes, it's why the Diary of Anne Frank is so compelling. You're seeing this, and so the students become emotionally involved in a way that really almost nothing else that I teach in modern U.S. history that we can do through these books.
Yeah, I mean, it's what we've been talking about throughout the semester is you can know the numbers of individuals who are impacted by things, but it's when you know the individual story, whether that's presented from a factual nonfiction book or through a fiction book, does it take on a different kind of level of empathy, I would say, you know?
And then when they get sent to on page 100, when they get sent to the the state,
Parchment.
yeah, when 100, when they get
Oh
to
yeah,
the state pen,
this one stuck out to me. This read around too. Go ahead.
quite often I get multiple sticky notes on that page, just how terrified the kids would be. And then the question is always about the bird on the last panel. And what does that mean? And what does the look on the bird mean? And when John Lewis is looking back, and is he kind of saying like, who, you're the real prisoner here? Well, at least I can fly away. Like we don't really know. But it's just funny that almost every time my students will focus on that one panel, and what Nate was trying to get across to us.
But I think that so here's my thought about this. I'm just gonna do it as a spread. I don't think it's like this in the book. But here's my thought on this, because this stuck out to me too. It is actually like this in the book. So these two pages are together. And I think back to David Walker, who his appeal to the colored citizens of the world, which was published in 1829. And he talks about, he's talking about enslavement, and he's also talking about, he gives the metaphor of, say that you're in a race, right? And that two animals are in a race, and one of them has been caged, right, for basically their whole life. Can you expect them to run the same race as an animal that's been freed, right? That's one thing I think about. So who's going to win? Who's going to lag behind? The other thing I think about is, I know why the caged bird sings. That kind of metaphor from Paul Laurence Dunbar and Maya Angelou, which comes up in comics, hardware specifically from Milestones, Wayne McDuffie and Dennis Cowan. But that idea of freedom, because that's kind of how I read this, is the bird is free. I'm looking at him, and because you have the panel tier 2 where the duck's swimming off. And then you also have, and I forgot who's being beaten, but you have an individual being beaten and then dragged off. And then you have the fence, which goes back and reminds us too of George Takei's They Called Us Enemy. Where he talks about at the end that the fence plays a huge kind of, symbol and imagery within that text. But he also has the comment that the fence was there to keep us in, but also to keep us safe.
Yeah.
It's probably too, in this case, that's not the case. I mean, we know that, but I kind of think about all that kind of imagery too going in together.
And when you say imagery, I mean, that I can't tell you how many, the Jewish Holocaust is probably the thing that most of my students know the most in depth. And when they see those fences, when they see the camps, when we read Nat Turner and we see the Confessions of Nat Turner by Kyle Baker, and you see the slaves on the ships, and they make these amazing mental jumps that they don't do with prose, because we are a visual creature. And it's just amazing that, because inevitably, whenever they see a prison and the high fences and all those sorts of things, and so it allows us to have that conversation of something that we all understand, I think, on a really deep level.
So I want to ask kind of a side question, and we don't have to go off on this, but have you gotten any pushback for Kyle Baker's Nat Turner?
I have not.
Okay.
I use it with my 10th grade course, and I really haven't.
That's really interesting, because I thought for sure you would get some pushback with that text. Okay, and that may look into teaching it too, because I like that text. It's very graphic though. That's kind of why I was asking. Okay, so give me one more.
So there's two that kind of go together. One
Okay.
is on page 135, when we see the police officer on bended knee with the little girl.
Yeah,
there.
and I like that, and that's actually the cover of the French edition. And I'll show that in just a second. 135, you said?
Yeah, 135.
Where is it? It's in here somewhere. There it is, right there.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah.
So you have that one, and we talk about, and so I show images from Ferguson and some of the other protests that we've seen here in the United States, and we talk about imagery and what that means. And so we talk about police officers can be unfairly categorized one way or the other, just like protesters can be, some people can call them rioters, right? So we have all these conversations, and this is just such a pause in the reading and all the chaos. And so we talk about the humanity where this is all going on. And then if you jump over to just 2 pages on page 137, now they turn the hoses on the kids.
Right.
So I don't mean to laugh, but it's just, my kids are all like, I see them. So they have this moment of peace and they think this is going to go one way. And of course, it goes completely the opposite of what my students were expecting it to do. And then, of course, at the very bottom, ring the dogs.
Well, which makes me think of, this image. I don't remember the whole context for it. It makes me think of this image from after Alton Sterling's murder, right? This one right here. And I think this one's a powerful image. Where let me put everything up real quick. And we've seen more, right?
Yep.
And then there's even the image of is it Elijah McClain hugging the officer, and then his story. I mean, that's a whole nother thing. Is it McClain? Is that who it was? I don't remember.
I forget his name.
Yeah, I don't remember his name. I'm sorry, but the fact that his adopted parents are basically using him for kind of social media stuff, and then end up killing him and his siblings basically in a murder suicide, right? I mean, it's just...
yeah.
So what's the other image that they always go to?
Oh, so that was those two together, that 135 and that 137. And then if you look on page 138, of course, then you get into these images where Nate has the number one comment is about the teeth on the dogs, and of course it's overemphasized. And then we take a look at the actual picture when they use German Shepherds on the protesters.
Right.
But it's this idea that we talk about, this is one person's mental viewpoint, mental image, mental what have you. And of course, the way that when we're emotionally involved in something, it takes on a whole new meaning that maybe a photograph doesn't, or maybe that a journal entry doesn't. And so that visual really kind of, so we go from just in a few pages, this peaceful, friendly police officer getting down on bended knee, to then we see, okay, now they're going to turn on the hoses. And now we get to this extreme violence with using the dogs on human beings. So and just within a few pages.
And then you're shifting it out too. And this is where I think a dark room with Edmund Pettus Bridge, Jackson's murder, and that kind of page in dark room where she shows the world and the news of the violence that is enacted upon the marchers goes around the world, right? This is kind of the same thing.
Yep.
The way that news and media travels and influences us. Now, it doesn't say how the story is being reported, but just seeing the images of it, right?
That makes a major change when Bloody Sunday and when the news cameras start to get, and so then white middle America starts to wake up and get involved. And that's what King tells us, that it's the big danger is when that middle portion is not involved. And so that this is why later, like with the Freedom Riders, where they start to target the journalists and the cameramen first, because they realize that they don't want these images getting out.
Right. So are there any other kind of images that you have from them that they kind of go to?
So in book 2, those are the ones that we tend to talk about the most.
Okay.
Yeah.
And here is actually I got too many windows open. Here's actually the French cover for book 2, right? And Wake Up America, Europe and specifically France and some other countries have a very large comics, kind of culture. You go into bookstores and there's just comics and graphic novels everywhere. And they take them very seriously, as I think we should too, and as I do, and you do, Tim, as well. But this is I think this is very interesting. This is the cover. It's not March, but it's Wake Up America, which is what Lewis says at the end of his speech, right? So do we want to talk a little bit about kind of Lewis's speech and King's speech? And do you have them read those? Because there's also a mention of Letter from Birmingham Jail in here too.
Our kids do a lot of work on Birmingham Jail in their English class. So they're already coming to me on that background. And part of the issue, and Andrew talks about this a lot, it's that 5-word kind of a problem where you've got Martin Luther King, Rosa Parks, and I Have a Dream. Yeah, that the kids don't even know that anybody else spoke on that day. And it was great because John Lewis, I mean, just recently, who passed, but he was somebody who was still with us from that day that the kids think was, 300 years ago.
Right.
And so I have them, they read the speech as edited and they read the speech in its original form. And then we kind of talk about why would they have it changed? What was the message of that? And so we kind of have this conversation of, Martin Luther King Jr. almost as like an old fart in a way, as some of the kids would have viewed him. And so like you had used the word monolithic before, they're not all on the same page. They don't all agree.
I mean, the other thing I think students need to realize is Martin Luther King Jr. started within the movement at the Montgomery bus boycotts in his 20s. It's not like he was old. He died before he was 40. I mean, he was assassinated at 38. Malcolm X was assassinated before he was 40, right? I think that's important for them to know too, but you're right. He'd already been in it. 56 was the Montgomery bus boycotts. This would have been 7 years or so, after that. And you see these tensions, which I want to bring up in just a second too, but go ahead. Sorry.
No, absolutely. I mean, I'm 47. I mean, the kids think I'm so ancient. So, I mean, even 40, 38, when you are a early college student or high school student and you're involved with SNCC and everything else, you're going to look at these guys as being so much older. I mean, that's a whole generation removed.
Mm-hmm. I mean, there is that discussion of Stokely Carmichael, right? Who we see these splits in Run, and we're not going to read Run, but Run takes place, of course, after 65. And we start to see the splits in SNCC. And I kind of wanted to bring this up. Actually, kind of two more things before I bring up the Carmichael, or one more thing before bringing the Carmichael thing, is the mention of Malcolm X, right? And I wanted to pull things from Malcolm X's The Ballad and the Bullet, which is 1964, which I think is a really important thing for students to read, because we have this dichotomy of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King fighting each other, right? Which isn't the case. But this also points out that nothing's monolithic. You also see John Lewis with Ralph Abernathy and Rustin and everybody else who's older, right? You see the tensions there. So it's not just the tensions between the younger King and the youngers, but it's also the tensions between the youngers and those older than King who have been involved, right? So you see all these things, but I would really, suggest have students read The Ballad and the Bullet along with I Have a Dream and Lewis's speech on the March on Washington. And then I would also have them read, sections, not the whole thing, but have them read like sections of, I always forget who we co-wrote it with, Stokely Carmichael and Charles Hamilton's Black Power from 1967. I mean, if you look at this is the opening. I just kind of want to go through it real quick, but they open with, what is racism? The word has represented daily reality to millions of Black people for centuries, yet it is rarely defined, perhaps just because that reality has been such a commonplace. By racism, we mean the predication of decisions and policies on considerations of race for the purpose of subordinating a racial group and maintaining control over that group. That has been the practice of this country toward the Black man. We shall see why and how, and they go through it. But what's important about this is they talk about individual racism and they talk about institutional racism, and they break it down. And I think this paragraph right here, which talks about the 16th Street bombing, moving into institutional racism, is important. They write, when white terrorists bomb a Black church and kill 5 Black children, that is an act of individual racism. And Lillian Smith talks about this too, widely deplored, and King talks about it, by most segments of the society. But when in that same city, Birmingham, 500 Black babies die each year because of the lack of proper food, shelter, and medical facilities, and thousands more are destroyed and maimed physically, emotionally, and intellectually because of conditions of poverty and discrimination in the Black community, that is a function of institutional racism. When a Black family moves into a home in a white neighborhood and is stoned, burned, and routed out, they are victims of an overt act of individual racism, which many people will condemn, at least in words. But it is institutional racism that keeps Black people locked in dilapidated slum tenements, subject to the daily prey of exploited slumlords, merchants, loan sharks, and discriminatory real estate agents. The society either pretends it does not know of this latter situation, or is in fact incapable of doing anything meaningful about it. And then they look at it, right? They look at these things. So I think it's important to kind of note that, because this is also the tension going on here. Should we march, or should we react? Because remember when they're learning in Nashville, there's the guy who's like, I can't do this. And then even here, Lewis is like, well, you can't smoke. And when he's in the line, you can't do this. You have to not react. And the question is, how much can you take?
Yeah. And that's the question I have with my kids, and where they think that, nonviolent resistance is either not doing anything or it's a sign of being a coward. And when we see those images, I tell the kids, I would have stand up and pop somebody in the face. And my kids are like, yeah. And I'm like, no, that's easy to do. I don't know that I would have the courage to sit there, because when you look at we say to the kids, like, what would happen if you actually did have a militant resistance, whether you're talking about Gandhi, whether you're talking about, it's not going to work. And we know that it's not going to work, because when you don't have that power, and of course, that's where the Black Panther movement and Black nationalism and all that kind of stuff comes in too. But that kind of really sticks with the kids. They go, oh, right. I don't know if I could have done that either.
Right. I mean, it's not easy. And I think that's something else I think students need to read, is the Black Panther Party by Walker and Anderson, right? It's a really good book that follows on the tail end of March and Run about the Black Panther Party and what they were doing. And we have these common misconceptions about Malcolm X or about the Black Panther Party that, need to be debunked, and even about the civil rights movement, right? Yeah. So what about, I haven't read his original speech. Where's it at? Is that what's reprinted in the book? I didn't get a chance to look at them together.
And I just go online, and it's not a huge difference, and I don't have it in front of me either, but there are certain things that are pulled out because they thought that he was being too, I guess, militant, for lack of a better word, and to have some certain changes. And he did compromise. And when you actually watch the speech and when he gives it, it's a different John Lewis. You can see the anger in his face when he's giving the speech on the steps. And it's kind of interesting because we don't really see that in the March graphic novels. And we certainly don't see that in the modern John Lewis videos that I show the kids. Him crowd surfing and
yeah, I have that one on here for him. I think it's important to kind of point out some things from his speech and from King's speech, his talk about police violence, right? Which we see enacted. His talk about different things in Albany, sharecroppers being kicked off their land. Ernest Gaines talks about this in the autobiography of Miss Jane Pittman, which is a fictional book too. His kind of discussion in paragraph 8, I think, it is relevant today. I mean, if you read more King, this is what King says too. I appeal to all of you to get into this great revolution. The use of that word, which they talk about, of course, in the book as being having pushback against, that is sweeping this nation. Get in and stay in the streets of every city, every village and hamlet of this nation until true freedom comes, until the revolution of 1776 is complete. And King picks up on this too in his, with the promissory note, right? We must get in this revolution and complete the revolution. And then he goes through the list of places. I think it's important for students to realize that, and getting to King's speech, what do they kind of take out of King's speech that they didn't know? Because what we quote from there is, I have a dream. And if you read that, there's it's a lot more, I would say, incendiary even for today.
And then we take it a step farther, and we talk about, like, I pull a lot from John Lewis has a book called Walking with the Wind.
Right.
And we pull excerpts from that too. And it's fascinating because King and Lewis and even Malcolm X start to talk more about economic inequality in addition to race. When Malcolm X and John Lewis meet in Africa, Lewis needs a break from SNCC, and of course Malcolm X needs to get out
from Elijah Muhammad.
Yeah, and Malcolm X says, you know what? I'm looking around here and I'm seeing wealthy Africans and poor Africans, and I'm kind of seeing some of the same treatment as we see between whites and blacks in the United States. And when you get into why were these guys really assassinated, and that whole question, and King speaking out against Vietnam, and we do this on every MLK Day when you had said, like, what quotes are being shared. Okay, but what else was he talking about too? Right. It wasn't just as simple as, let's all hug it out and wait it out kind of a thing.
Well, that's what the Poor People's Campaign is, right? I mean, I would one of the essays that I read that I was like, I'm so glad I read, and I can't believe I never read it, was A Testament of Hope, which was published posthumously, right? And he talks about the class disparities there, but he also reiterates the police violence. He also reiterates that. He also reiterates, the fact that American history has long denied equality. So he's reiterating all this stuff, but you see his discussions of the class inconsistencies too. And one of the reasons, of course, that Fred Hampton was murdered, and others as well, is because of their trying to pull together a coalition of whites and blacks. It becomes a class struggle within that kind of context. And y'all seen that in Ernest Gaines's of Love and Dust, the way that Marshall kind of pits Bon Bon against Marcus. I know you haven't read that, but that's one of the books they read, but they see that. And that's what's going on. I mean, this goes back to the colonial period with Native Americans, African Americans, and poor whites.
Yep. Well, and that's a conversation of why would, if the majority during the Civil War whites are not wealthy enough to own a slave, why would you fight in that war? And so, right. I mean,
well, that instance is because it gets you close to whiteness, especially after the war. Because before the war, you're being treated, a lot of the black codes that come out after the war are geared towards poor whites in the South. Before the war, Carrie Lee Merritt's Masterless Men, if y'all are interested in reading about that, she details some of those laws. So, I mean, there's a lot there, but what do they kind of pull out? One of the things I want to mention before we kind of get into the Ivor Dream speeches, look at the rhetorical moves in there. I mean, you can use King's speeches or other speeches to look at rhetoric. And one of the things that I use in my own writing is anaphora, a rhetorical term, the repetition of words or phrases at the beginning of clauses or sentences. And you see that, right, within his speech. And of course, coming from the Black church, that's part of that too, but driving home a point. You see it multiple times in there. I've like lost track of how many times I kind of put it in there. But what are some things they kind of pull out of his speech that they're like, wow, I can't believe he said that in that speech at that moment?
I wish I had it in front of me. We'll be doing that at the end of this in about a week and a half. I off the top of my head, I'm sorry, I can't think of what words they would have that they pick out.
Well, the two I always think about are America's Default on its Promissory Note. That's the one I think about. And the other one I always think about is, he says, people ask me, when will you be satisfied? And his first answer is, when there's an end to police brutality. Those are the two things that I think people need to remember about that speech when they quote the end. And there's more in here too, but those are two of the big things that I always think about. And I kind of want to show y'all real quick too. I kind of want to show y'all some of these pieces. So this is before the march. This is, I don't know if you can read it, but this is from my hometown newspaper, my home area. Shreveport is across the river from where I grew up. I was born in Shreveport. But this is before the march, right? And it's really interesting the way they talk about it, and they talk about the church. And I think that this is kind of, this paragraph right here on my cursor is, in some instances, this amazing doctrine has taken the aspects of frenzied fanaticism, in which its advocates seem to contend that in some way, their course is simply one of the divine law of God, scourging the evil out of man's law, that all of it is furtherance of God's will. So the protest and marching against injustice, right? But in plain fact and simple language, what is being advocated is this, and this is what the author says that these people are saying who say that it's God's law. It's all right for me to break a law if I say that the so-called black rights are the objective, but it's not right for you to uphold laws which for decades have protected the established rights of all people of all colors if I object. It's the law and order argument, right? That is indeed a jungle philosophy, and even kind of that language, the tenet of the beast and the savage. So saying that, well, it's the Romans 13 argument. If y'all know that God put people in places of power and laws in places of power, you can't challenge them. But if you read kind of that whole chapter, it switches to talking about love your neighbor. The follow-up is this. So this is, I forget who it is, the Public Safety Commissioner, George D'Artois, and somebody else, I think maybe the sheriff. Let me see. Yeah, the Shreveport Police Chief went to the March on Washington in 63. And this is their report back. They say it was a flop.
Wow.
And there was a big civil rights movement. King came to Shreveport, and I talk about that down here. He came in 58. But there were, I think, 250,000 people there, and they said there were 85,000. Notice the language they used here. They looked like beatniks. The blacks were shabbily dressed. They weren't doing anything. They looked like they were slovenly. And if you look at pictures, that's not the case.
Yeah.
Just kind of the language about it. And the other thing about this guy too, which I think is horrendous, apart from being charged with killing his campaign manager, former campaign manager, later in life. But after the Birmingham bombing, after the 4 girls were killed in the 16th Street bombing, there was a memorial service in Shreveport at a church. I forget the church. And they didn't want to have it. He rode in on his horse. I think it was him. And I think he was part of the police force at that time. Maybe the chief rode on his horse and basically started beating people around on his horse in the church.
Wow.
So that was the rhetoric being thrown around. You see some of that in March book 2 you see the famous George Wallace speech.
Ugh.
You see the others too. But I think it's worth having students read. Maybe that's something to do. Have students research what their local newspapers were saying about these events. And it's pretty easily done. It's not as difficult as it sounds to do.
Yeah, you don't have to go on microfilm anymore. The kids
No.
don't even know what that is.
So, have you ever done something like that?
I have not done. So we've worked with the local historical society for local heroes and things, but that's actually a fascinating idea. We have not done gone to the Philadelphia Inquirer or something like that. To take a look at the 1960s. That's actually a really fascinating idea to do.
Well, what I think that does is that actually gives it gives you as an educator, for one, and this is a person, but it gives students kind of the information and the knowledge that this is not. I think they start to see the similarities between the rhetoric that's being used and the way the rhetoric has continued to be used, right? And I think that's important, is to kind of see the connections between these things.
Yeah, it just I was looking ahead in the book 3 when you're talking about the bombing. It just what I love is the way Nate Powell handles so many what would be awful images, and you just see a bloody shoe.
Yeah.
It's handled so well. My own kids read March in middle school. I don't know if I would teach it middle school, but I know a lot of people do.
I don't remember when my daughter read it. I think she may have just read them like a couple years ago, and she's 15 now.
It's not traumatic, but at the same time, it makes it that much more powerful because you're not turned away from some awfully graphic image.
So what about this scene? And I kind of want to end on this. This is George Wallace being sworn in Montgomery. Anything about this scene that your students kind of pull to? I just noticed him right here. He looks like a Lex Luthor kind of villain. And then you also see, it's not on things, but you do see the battle flags. And I have noticed these. Right.
Yep.
And this is his infamous segregation now, segregation today, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever speech.
I have to actually play the speech for the kids because it's almost like unbelievable that this would be said.
Right.
And again, this idea that, laws don't change people. And I think that's a really powerful. So we do. So again, these books, a lot of times when the kids stop and they look up, that's when we have the conversations. We're a one-to-one school. So the kids, it's really easy for them to start doing some research. If nothing else, these books allow us to do that, to kind of take a look at, like you're saying, some of these documents and speeches and things like that, as opposed to me just handing them a DBQ packet of, okay, here's all these speeches and analyze them.
So I want to give y'all a couple of more things real quick. And actually, this made me think about, I want to end on Ross Barnett's I Love Mississippi speech. So that's one we can show here. We could probably show the George Wallace one too, but I kind of want to end on that. But I want to show you this. And I'm not sure if you know this, Tim. And the only reason I know this is because I've been to Montgomery and I was taught at Auburn. This is Montgomery. Okay. So this is downtown Montgomery. This is the state capitol right here. Okay. Do you notice any, do you notice what the state capitol is on? Or what kind of intersects with the T?
Well, I was just looking at the Confederate Memorial Monument.
Yeah, that's a whole nother thing.
Yeah.
But what, you notice what street this is, right? Dexter
Oh,
Avenue
yeah.
comes up to it.
Hmm.
Here's Dexter Avenue Baptist Church right here. 1 block from the Capitol. King was preacher at Dexter Avenue in the 50s, right? He was there during the bus boycotts. What struck me when I was there, I didn't even think about George Wallace's speech when I was there at the time. There's a historical marker here marking King's, King being the pastor at Dexter Avenue. Right here, and I can probably show you actually. So here's the street view. There's a historical marker somewhere. It looks like right there. See? So let's come across here towards the Capitol. So there's the Capitol. There's this marker right here. Do you know what this marker is? Any idea what this marker may be?
I have no idea.
You can't read it. Let me see if we can read it from here. Probably not. Okay. So here's a stone marker right here. So, and like I said, here's the Capitol. This stone marker right here, right across the street from this marker, is a marker put up by the UDC. And I don't know what year. I'd have to look back and see what year. But it's a marker saying this is Jefferson Davis's inaugural parade route when he became president of the Confederacy.
Wow.
So you have these two markers immediately across the street from each other. And Montgomery is really, I wouldn't say it's a unique city in that way, because that's how it is in a lot of places. Savannah, I would say, included. But the fact that it's right here from the Capitol where Wallace gave the speech, where Jefferson Davis took became the president of the Confederacy, this, and then this. It's just a lot within the physical public space, right, to think about. And what does that kind of do as somebody walking through that space? There's still the White House of the Confederacy is still there too. And that's actually a place you can go tour. I didn't go to it. The EJI is there. And one other interesting kind of side note too is the last capital of the Confederacy was Shreveport, where I showed you those newspaper articles before. So when the Confederacy was falling, that was where the last capital was, I think, for a couple of months maybe. So that's a lot of historical stuff, I know, and that's how we typically get into. But I want to show you, I want to end with this. Or anything you want to say about that?
No, you just.
I mean, what can you say?
Yeah, I think it will be something I will be including with my kids, though.
So I haven't watched this clip. I don't know. Hold up. Let me see, because it's not a long speech. It's only like a few words. All right, I'm just going to give you this. I'll just give you this video. Okay. So this is Ross Barnett, the governor of Mississippi when James Meredith integrated Ole Miss in 1962, October 1962. This is before, or September 1962. I don't remember, September, October. It was 1962. This is before, I think the night before he integrated, so the night before the riots, he gave a speech, just a few words, at the football game. And notice the imagery at the football game. Remember, Ole Miss was the rebels too.
But the Armory is short distance from down. He hasn't clarified what kind of support can be expected, but Walker has said any violence would be initiated by the federal government. Barnett finally appeared on the side porch of the stately old mansion, took time out to greet the Louisiana delegation and accept their nicely inscribed proclamation. Council. They surrounded the mansion, cheering Barnett and waving Confederate flags. It may be that an attempt will be made to seize Governor Barnett from the mansion today, and we want you here to try to prevent that from happening. Well, nothing happened and then broke up. It was the only large-scale event of the day, the kind of day when most Mississippians were with their families, facing the tomorrow which has been postponed so often.
Here's the speech. This is the Ole Miss football game. And you notice they're in gray uniforms.
Yeah.
That's his speech. That's it.
Yeah.
I love Mississippi. I love our people. I love and respect our heritage. And he's saying a lot within those kind of 9 to 10 words, right? That's what George, I mean, I show you that to show you that that's Mississippi. And he talks about in here going into the heart of the beast in Mississippi, basically. And that's Mississippi. And George Wallace, of course, is Alabama.
Right.
So anything you want to wrap up with? I mean, there's a lot we didn't cover, a lot we did cover.
Yeah. I
Just
mean,
how it goes.
Yeah, even with teaching these books in my class, I mean, it's only one part of a history course, and there's only so much that you can do. And so again, it's just that hope of the kids. This is what they remember more so than just about anything else that we do. So it really is a powerful vehicle, if nothing else, to get. I mean, the kids will email me from college and say, "Oh, I remember that because I remember the image on, book 1 or book 2." But again, what I love is at the end of this, we talk about John Lewis's more modern, where he supported civil rights for everybody, and so it wasn't, we talk about it's not just a black and white thing, it's not just a 1960s thing, it's something that is still ongoing and something that we still need to focus on. And so I think with using John Lewis in that way, it is something that I think that empowers our students. And then when we're all done, I just had a couple here, but my kids will make their own comic books.
Oh yeah, can you talk about that real quick? Because that's one thing I think I shared actually the Twitter thread with them on Canvas. Can you talk about having them do that assignment, making their own comics? I've had students do that too, and I think it's a really great thing to have students do in class. There are multiple kind of programs to have students do it, but can you kind of talk about that and then share?
Yeah, so I say, hey, you let me know what's a modern civil rights movement that you want to do research on. And some of the kids immediately, they got it. Some of the kids, women's rights, some of the kids want to do Latino, some of the kids want to do LGBTQIA, and some of the other kids aren't really sure. And so we just kind of do some Google, and within, a half hour, we've got all different kinds of things that we're talking about. And so I'll put the kids in groups of 2 to 3, and they do a lot of research. And so they do an annotated works cited page that has to go along with it. On
That's
each
what I have them do too.
Yeah, so you're teaching the skills along with it. And on each page, they need to have, one quote, one statistic, one what have you. So it's a fictional story, but then also at the end of it, they bring it to a conclusion with how they would suggest we fix this problem. And so, this whole thing altogether. So my artistic students, they could draw the cover. And then other students can use something like Pixton or storyboard that, or whatever it might be, to do the interior. And then I honestly was in tears. I also have autistic students. So social studies tends to be the course that we do more inclusion rather than, saying honors, academic, what have you. And they did about how COVID impacted them, about not being able to go to the supermarkets, which is where they worked and where they worked out a lot of real life skills. And that the kids all clapped for them. And it was just something that they were really proud of, because yes, as autistic kids need civil rights too. And it's such a different way to look at things. And so it's student choice. So some of it will do it according to their race. I had kids do it on Bubba Wallace.
Yeah, that's the one I was going to mention. I remember that one.
Yeah. So you get some that are, done that way. And then other kids will hand draw it. So it's all based on their ability level. And then it's something that, again, visually we can hang up in the hallway, and students will walk by and they stop and they look through it. And so it's a way for us to get the message out farther than just within our classroom.
And the other thing you mentioned too, that I think educators need to remember, is you have them do an annotated bibliography. So it is like an essay. It's a creative essay, is essentially what it is. And one thing that we're not reading Run, but Run's not the only one that does this. At the back of Run, Iden, Lewis, and Powell were very explicit about doing, I think, the works cited page at the end of that, saying where the information comes from, right? Yep. You don't get that in March, but you get that in Run. There's a whole end section that gives you footnotes about where these sources come from.
Yeah.
So you can do further research. And I think it's not needed for a book like that, but I think it's important. And I think you can make these things to hit whatever state standard you're working on in an English class, in a history class, because you're having them do research to actually produce this final product.
Yeah, and really for me, as I see it as a humanities teacher, what's great is it really brings home the idea, the importance of pre-writing.
Right.
Because with a comic, it's not like writing an essay. It's not like
right.
you really have to think about how many panels, what's going in each panel. And the kids will come out of this saying, wow, we really had to do a lot of thinking, because you don't want to start creating these panels and then have to either delete them or change them. It's not really easy to do. You can't just hit the backspace button.
Do you have them, this is probably a broader conversation, do you have them write a script?
They do.
Initially?
So first they pitch the idea to me, they pitch the research to me, then they turn in their annotated works cited page, and then they have to script it. But their script can also be in sketch form.
Yeah.
I'm fine either way.
Yeah, I mean, I started writing some scripts, and it's a totally different kind of thought process when you're laying out the page, because you're having to think about how things are going to move.
Yeah.
And where you want your reader's eyes to go, all this type of stuff. So yeah, that's a broader conversation, but thank you for sharing that with us, and thank you for taking time with me today.
No, absolutely, my pleasure.